we call this evening More Questions Than Answers, and partly because we recognise that actually COVID, being in lockdown, and all these different experiences are throwing up stacks and stacks and stacks of questions that I guess we're all wrestling with in different ways. Sam, what questions are you wrestling with at the moment?
The question that's really come to be highlighted for me during COVID is a question that I've been struggling with that precedes COVID, and it has to do with who and what is being thrown away in our midst. So if I can just create a little frame for that question.
Yeah.
This relates to really how my imagination is shaped very much by being a gardener. And for those of us who share Christian faith, that shouldn't come as a shock, since our narrative, it begins in a garden. It says, God created the world and planted the earth creature in a garden. So I, in many ways, feel like I'm a late bloomer to garden. I didn't really start actively gardening until I was in my 30s, but it's shaped my imagination. So what happened was, one of the things you notice when you garden is how everything fits. There's no waste. So God designed creation so that everything fits, everything belongs. So just imagine, we've gone through fall, the leaves fall, they go on the ground. They're not litter, of course, but if you live in an urban environment where you only have tarmac, people tend to even treat leaves like litter. They're just something that you want to throw away. So gardening, you have to begin with soil, and soil is made, we can participate with that by making compost, where we literally, compost means to put together. So you put together things that are decaying, that have no apparent value or use, but when you put them together, life happens out of that. So Andrew, that question, to go back to the question, I would say that the compost pile, working with soil, taking things, whether they're banana peels, eggshells, coffee grounds, neighbors' green waste, but taking all those things that were allegedly rubbish, then putting them together to make soil and see life happen, then that became a parable for me of how God works. God doesn't waste anything. So then if that's how God works, then God doesn't waste anything, then we also need to kind of shift back to the question, who or what is being thrown away. We recognize that in the world we live in, the default settings of society, things that have no economic value, whether they're people or places, tend to get rubbished. They tend to get neglected. They tend to get thrown away. And I think that's really kind of come up to the surface during COVID. As a shorthand concept, Pope Francis says in Laudato Si', his encyclical, we live in a throwaway culture where people and things who have no economic value, we throw them away, we discard them. So my question is, moving from the garden to wider society, is who or what is being rubbished or discarded in my midst, or our midst? And what would it take to reincorporate them as a gift, to show that their value is inherent in being a creature?
Okay, so the questions about who has been kind of left out in some ways and put to the side. I guess I'm interested. Do you see, has the people that you've been observing as being discarded, has that changed through COVID, or is it still the same kind of group of people? How does that work?
Yeah, the other thing that I would add is that the one coin drop moment or aha moment for me is in my ecological conversion was doing a garden in Birmingham, outside of H&P Birmingham. And Andrew, you've been to that garden, you've walked in that space. So for everyone else, H&P Birmingham, which is the second largest men's prison in England, is, well, it's on the edge of our neighborhood. It's at the kind of edge of Summerfield and Winson Green. And as a prison chaplain from 2015 to 2016, there was an invitation to do a garden outside on the visitor center. So this is outside the prison. but it was with resettled prisoners and residents in the community. So the aha moment for me was, on the one hand, doing the composting, just doing that everyday routine of taking things that I used to think were trash or rubbish, to use British English, putting them together to make soil, to make life happen. But then as I was going to the prison, the aha moment, Andrew, was, oh, right, the prison, this is what we do with people that have allegedly have no value, have no place in society. We discard them and we put them in this container. And then the garden became that, a sign really of what if God doesn't waste anything, what would it look like to build a garden of discarded things with people who have been discarded? So that was 2016. To update that, I would just say, I haven't been in a prison in a year. I can't get in. I'm not essential staff. And through our community development work, we ended up starting a community business. It's a community co-op called Eat, Make, Play. That began as an event called Eat, Make, Play. And to go back to who is being discarded, what do I notice? I think what I notice more than anything is, it's not just prisoners. It's not just, someone who has a criminal record. I think that would be a more obvious example, and that stigma of being discarded. But it's just people who, every neighborhood has people who might be unemployed, might be struggling, might not have that sense of belonging in whether it's in a school or through work or whatever. And yet every neighborhood, those same people who are on the edge or kind of pushed out or discarded have passions and gifts. I think this is the pattern that I see. So at Eat, Make, Play, I'm thinking about a friend of mine named Ray, who he lives behind our shop. And Ray, we became friends by gardening on the high street in Ladywood. And what I discovered, being around Ray is, and Ray connected me to Abba, another guy. And then through Abba, I met Faisal. And what's happening is they all have skill. It just hadn't been activated. So I think there's something about the intersection between gardening and community organizing or development is, I think it goes back to this idea of the question and the answer. I'm constantly going, what is the question being asked here? What do people want? Instead of assuming that I already know the answer. So the garden is a place where it gives people permission to show up and bring their gifts. I think that's the pattern that I've seen.
I guess in some ways you're talking a bit about an ecology of relationships as much as you're talking about the kind of ecology of the land. I'm a bit more kind of on safe ground there now if we talk about people and relationships than I am pushing the gardening metaphor too far.
And I have to remember I am talking to someone whose entire back garden is slabbed. So
so maybe absolutely
we can work on the actual practice of gardening later, Andrew. But absolutely, it's both the actual practice of caring for soil and plants, but it's also a metaphor for every neighborhood is an ecology of relationships. It's exactly that. It's so in the same way in a garden, you can companion plant and put, if you put carrots and onions next to one, will repel the pests that are attracted to another. And so there's a beneficial relationship. When you put Ray beside Abba in a garden, like something magical happens. There's just, those gifts are activated. And, but what I want to say is, it's the garden that I've noticed gives people permission for those relationships to emerge. It's like, if you didn't have that space, you need a space to bump, and the garden is a great bumping space where people can show up and then say, oh, I could do that in my back garden, or my neighbor, can I invite her? And then you start to weave this fabric. At a certain point in time, I don't know when it eroded here in the UK, but those relationships probably would have just happened in super informal ways. And I think Eat, Make, Play as a community space is trying to reweave those relationships. And so instead of it being about, we're here, we have a bunch of stuff,
Mm.
it's, we're just trying to notice what are the gifts that are there, what are the relationships that can be tended, and how can that grow together.
At the moment, you've spoken in very colourful and visual kind of community development language.
Mm.
One of the things that you failed to disclose earlier on was that you're also a theologian, a trained theologian, not just like everybody else trying to muddle our way through. That's part of what you do. When you think of that metaphor, when you think about what's going on there, what are there any kind of theological frameworks that you bring into looking into that kind of relationship building space?
Yes, absolutely. I think there are a couple of concepts for me. I mean, one is I mentioned in passing this concept of ecological conversion. That's also Pope Francis talks about ecological conversion in Laudato Si. Uh, in English, the subtitle is On Care for Our Common Home. So that's the frame. We're humans. And as Christians, we recognize that our vocation, that the world we're in is not just stuff, it's not just landscape, it's creation. God made it, and our vocation is to care for it as our common home. So I suppose that's like the widest frame.
Yeah.
And but going back to what I said about discarded throwaway culture, this is the theological, I think theology helps us name this tension. The air we breathe, like we're in history, we're in time right now in the middle of COVID, and that's intensified what Pope Francis calls our throwaway culture. It's almost like let's connect it to Romans 12. Romans 12 says, do not be conformed to the pattern of this world. There's a pattern, there's a logic. That pattern, we could say, is things that are of no economic value tend to get discarded. They tend to be thrown away. Um, in the middle of that logic, in the middle of that air that we breathe, Romans continues to say, do not be conformed to that pattern, but be transformed by the renewal of your mind. So that renewal of your minds, metanoia would be the Greek word. Conversion as is to be turned. So the theological framework would be to encounter Christ is to encounter a person who, that person is also the one in whom all things hold together. It's Colossians 1:17. So I would draw a line between Romans 12 and Colossians. They all things hold together in Christ. So if you want to be aligned with the pattern of creation, not just the pattern of your age, align yourself with Christ. And then that turning to Jesus turns us back to the world, into this throwaway culture. So I see the theological way of putting it would be that our vocations as Christians is, yes, to care for creation. But if you just say that, you're like, well, of course, we're called to care for creation. No, but we're called to care creation in a moment when we already, the air we breathe says the Amazon is just, it's land for cattle to grow soy. Let's cut the trees down. Yeah. Or, the stuff around us is just raw material for us. And what doesn't serve us, we throw away. Do you see the tension that I'm trying to get at? Yeah. So we're called to interrupt, subvert, pick your word, the logic of throwing things and people away who don't have economic value, and to the theological baseline of all of it is the worth of any person or thing is inherent. It's not ascribed. You're not worthy because you're employed or you've done X, Y, and Z. Your worth is that you're a creature. So the work in the middle of the throwaway culture is to manifest that dignity, manifest that goodness. So we're swimming against one logic and trying to, in the middle of it, say, God created it, God created it good, and our vocation is to care for it, even if the world says it's rubbish.
I like the idea that in some ways people's worth is wrapped up in their ability to be able to show up and offer their gift. That actually, and it
Yeah.
sounds like in some ways what's going on in the work that you're doing, it is creating spaces where people can show up and just and offer their gifts, and that in some ways is an opportunity to share worth with one another. And I guess one of the things that I'm wrestling with as you're talking is I can see how all that works in pre-COVID times, where it's easy for
Yeah.
people to show up. How has COVID affected that? I mean, I guess it's slightly different being
Yeah.
outdoors and all that kind of thing, but has it had an impact on
Yeah.
the work that you've been doing?
Two things to get into the COVID, because obviously you can tell by the stories I'm telling and the hats I said I wear. I'm a Christian who is not I don't spend my days with an institutional role in the church, but I very much see myself as a Christian who's in the world, you know, and I think that's part of the vocation of any Christian. But yeah, I'm doing community development around gardens and in a high street space. So obviously, when I'm in those spaces, I don't walk around talking about Romans 12 unless someone asks me, why do you think that way about the discarded things? But I do talk about throwaway culture. I do talk about in creation, nothing is wasted. So what do we, yeah. So I just want to make I think you do have to find ways to translate depending on the space you're in. But that said, I'll just give two examples of how COVID both extended, kind of fits with everything I said, but kind of intensified it. One was I got a call from a Christian farmer, a lovely man named John Plum, who his farm is just on the edge of Birmingham. And he called during the beginning of COVID and said, Sam, here's the deal. I've got a field full of potatoes. Actually, it was his field and another farmer's field. So basically, the chippies are closed. So the middleman, McCain's, who handles all those big contracts, they just canceled the order. So I've got 10 to 12 tons of spuds in the ground, and I would be gutted to waste them and plow them back into the ground. But I've got to get that next crop in. If we got them out of the ground and showed, because again, the value is inherent, they exist, they're good. Could you get them to people in emergency food? Could you mobilize that? So Kate, who's on the call, I remember asking Kate and just called John back and said, yes, the answer is yes, we'll figure out how. And we rescued about, I don't know, if it was 9, 11, 12 tons of potatoes. And all of our neighbors who were either on furlough or were unemployed or were available, we had rotas with Sign Up Genius, where we had everyone socially distanced, and we had rotas, but by the end of it, we never wanted to see a potato or peel one again, right? But that to me was a sign. Again, it was a parable of, it was both just the practical action that I would hope anyone would do in the same situation of, there are people over here that need food. There's food over here. How do we get it to them? At the same time, that to me, that project was a parable about saying the farmer's time was valuable, the potatoes are valuable, the people that receive them are valuable, and we just, again, found a way to mobilize our friends to connect the dots. And the other thing that I would say is an underutilized green space that's near Edgbaston Reservoir, which is in, if you know Birmingham, B16, Edgbaston Reservoir. There was an underutilized green space that we did some community events, and Eat, Make, Play actually was born as an event called Eat, Make, Play. We just called it Eat, Make, Play, and it stuck. And then when lockdown happened, there was so much appetite, Andrew, for people saying, I just want to get outside. And we actually had beautiful weather in late April and March. And people, I think, to sum it up, people were looking for something meaningful to do and someone to do it with, which I think gets back to that ecology of relationships and gifts. So we built a lockdown garden by Edgbaston Reservoir. And that was very much the work of lots of hands coming together. So again, I don't know if that totally answers your question, but the point is, to me, it's about There's an underutilized space. How do we show its beauty, its goodness? There are potatoes over here. How do we show that they're valuable? And how do we do that with people, just our relationships, and to show that your time is valuable? What you bring is valuable. It's not just, are you being paid to do it? No, all of that. So I think it's that exchange of value that I'm noticing during COVID. People are really hungry for, of course, if people are employed, they might be really keen to keep their job. And there's some urgent issues around formal economy. But what we see is in the informal economy, this share economy or solidarity economy, there's a lot of value being exchanged. And so we're just trying to create stages where that happens.
You've been here 10 years. You've originally came over partly to do a PhD.
That's right.
Which was based on Ivan Illich, to use more of your accent than my accent. And in some ways, that's all about conviviality. It's all about the nature of relationships. Do you want to just give us some headlines as to what are some of the important things that you were talking about those relationships in the research that you did?
If you've never heard of Illich, I had never heard of Illich before 2007, and I was introduced to Illich's writings through a friend named Claudio, and I couldn't get Illich out of my head. It's like he was both this guiding light, but also this incredibly critical voice around Christian mission and kind of forms of mission, colonialism. So he was both super critical and also incredibly constructive. And it felt like he was just shining a light on the path that I was walking as, yes, a white male, North American missionary in Brazil. So one of the key words in Illich is conviviality. Actually, I'll come back to conviviality. I think it would make more sense since the one key word is the incarnation. So Illich says that the vocation of the Christian life is to prolong the incarnation. He doesn't mean that we replace Jesus. We're not messiahs. That's not what he means. He just means that the Christian life is that we share in the life of Christ. So I connect this very much to John 20, as the Father sends me, the sending narrative in John. As the Father sends me, so I send you, receive the Spirit. So Christians, through baptism, we have this promise that we've received the same Spirit that raised Jesus from the dead, and we're meant to be his body in the world, the body of Christ. So that's really what he's trying to get at. So that means you can't be the body of Christ in the world without bodily encounter. So encounter becomes a really important word for Illich. So he talks about, he does a lot with the parable of the Good Samaritan. And I think one thing I got from Illich that this will connect to conviviality is Illich's reading of the parable of the Good Samaritan, often like Sunday school version is you tell the story and then the Samaritan, the Levite passed on the other side, the priest passed by, and the Samaritan cares for the man in the ditch, right? And the moral of the story is love your neighbor. The problem with that reading, I mean, that works at one level, but every good Jew already knew that because the great commandment is to love your neighbor as yourself. There wouldn't have been anything shocking about them going, oh, right, Jesus wants us to love our neighbor. What the twist that Illich brings in the reading, he says, Illich was a historian. So he did a lot of reading about the history of interpretation of the Good Samaritan. And after Kant, I'm not a philosopher, but after Kant, with his categorical imperative, that almost all Christian sermons about the Good Samaritan it turns it into an ought. You ought to care for your neighbor. And Illich is saying the surprise in the story is the person that asked Jesus the question was trying to know. Jesus basically inverts the question. So instead of it just being, okay, I'm going to give you a circle and I'm going to draw a circle for you. And everyone in that circle is your neighbor and you should care for them. And anyone outside that circle, don't worry about them. Jesus tells this story that inverts the in and outness of the whole question. So the point is, what's radical, Illich says, is that anyone could be your neighbor. The question is not who is my neighbor, is are you willing to neighbor? Are you willing to be encountered by anyone and offer them care? So are you willing to be moved in your gut, as the story tells? So that idea of encounter, that you actually have to bodily be moved, means that you have to be touched in some way. You can't do that from afar. That's one move that Illich does. And then the other concept that he talks about is conviviality. We have the word in English. It's much stronger in Portuguese, and it just means life together, really. But Illich uses conviviality to mean freedom and interdependence. So if I were to paraphrase it, conviviality is about freedom and interdependence. So the moment we're in during COVID, I think there's a great temptation, pre-COVID, but certainly during COVID, to think there's going to be one institutional or technical solution to everything. Like if we just get the vaccine, we're sorted. And I really do hope that the vaccine rolls out, with speed, and the vaccine has its place. But Illich's point is, if you think that everything that people and communities need to flourish is a jab or a benefit payment, something that you get from an institution, then you will become dependent on that. That's what he calls institutional dependence. And then the other extreme would be, just being independent, like absolutely kind of isolated individuals without any sense of collectivity. So conviviality for Illich is a third way. It's certainly not being an isolated individual without any social fabric, but it's also not expecting that all the goods that we need to flourish are going to come from an institution. Like the health, the life we seek is not something we get, it's something that we share. So that's conviviality, is saying the life we want, whether that's during COVID or beyond the immediate restrictions, it's not going to be one technical fix, but it's going to be a relational possibility. And the question is, are we willing to be neighbors on purpose? Are we willing to show up and encounter our neighbors?
What you seem to be saying is it's not like you've got we need to be halfway between the institutional response and the independent person. Actually, we need to shift the question a little bit and say almost, what kind of society do we want to be, and not just leave that as a nice heady question, but actually show up and embody that kind of society.
Absolutely. And I think that's it. But when you put it that way, what kind of society we want, again, I think the temptation is that we'll have a different center. And I think what Illich is saying, it's not being anti-institutional. It's just saying the change that we want will never come just by a policy shift or just by a vaccine. So, as an American in the UK, I always say the NHS is the best broken system I've ever been a part of. And I hope you hear that as a real compliment. It's healthcare in the States, it's so precarious. Even when you pay out of your pocket for health insurance, it's still precarious. So I'm grateful for the NHS, but you don't go to the NHS and get health. You get treatment. And Illich is saying, we need more than treatment. We need more than the vaccine. We need more than the benefit payment. And you can't get the things that we need just from a centralized policy shift or program. It will be generated, yes, by community showing up.